For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, there was just one church. But today, you've got two massive branches, Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. So how on earth did one of the world's biggest religions basically split right down the middle? Well, that's what we're here to unpack, the incredibly complex story of what's known as the Great Schism.
So here's how we're going to tackle it. We'll start with their shared beginnings, then look at the cracks that started to form over hundreds of years. We'll dive into the big break in 1054, see how each church went its own way, and finally, look at the surprisingly recent efforts to maybe, just maybe, patch things up.
All right, first things first, and you've got to get this to understand the rest. For a solid 1,000 years, there was no Catholic versus Orthodox. It was all one single united Christian church.
Think of it like a giant tree. Before they were two separate, massive branches, they were part of the same trunk. They shared the same roots, the same history, the same early leaders, and the same fundamental beliefs. They were one and the same.
And this shared foundation, it's incredibly deep. I mean, to this day, both churches accept the first 7 great councils that hashed out what it even meant to be Christian. They both have 7 sacraments, they both trace their bishops all the way back to the original apostles, and they even share a whole bunch of saints from that first millennium. The groundwork is identical.
So, if they started out so unified, what happened? Well, the split wasn't some sudden explosion. It was more like a slow, creeping separation that happened over centuries, thanks to huge shifts in culture, politics, and of course, theology.
Honestly, the best way to picture it is like continental drift. You have the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. At first, they were connected, but slowly, almost without anyone noticing, they started drifting apart until they were basically living in two completely different worlds.
And you can see these pressure points building over time. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, it left a huge power vacuum, and the Pope started to step in and fill it. Meanwhile, in the East, the Byzantine Empire was going strong, with its own powerhouse center in Constantinople. This created totally different political realities, and you started to see previews of the main event, like the Phodian Schism, which was all about who was really in charge.
It all created these very different vibes. In the East, the language of faith was Greek, and they thought in terms of deep philosophy and mystery. In the West, it was all Latin, law, and structure. And this divide trickled down into everything, even the kind of bread they used in communion. It seems like a small thing, but it was a symbol of this much bigger growing gap.
Okay, so all of this tension that's been simmering for centuries, it's about to boil over. The final breaking point came down to 2 huge, knockdown, drag-out fights, one about power and the other about the very nature of God himself.
The first one was about authority. The West, centered in Rome, came to believe that the Pope had universal jurisdiction over the entire church. He was the boss, period. But the East, they saw it totally differently. For them, the Pope was the first among equals. Yeah, he got the seat of honor, but he was like the senior partner in a law firm, not the sole owner with the power to fire everybody.
And then there was the filioque controversy. Now this sounds super technical, but stick with me. Filioque is just Latin for "and the Son." The Church in the West added this little phrase to the Nicene Creed, the core statement of Christian faith, saying the Holy Spirit comes from the Father and the Son. For the East, this was a catastrophe. Not only did they disagree with the theology, but they were furious that the West had just decided to change the universal creed all by itself.
And the year it all finally imploded was 1054.
So envoys from the Pope went to Constantinople, things got heated, and what happened next was pure drama. The Roman delegates marched into the most famous church in the city, the Hagia Sophia, and slammed a papal bull of excommunication down on the main altar. They basically fired the leader of the Eastern Church. Well, the Patriarch didn't take that sitting down. He turned right around and excommunicated them back. And that was it. The split was now official.
After 1054, the two churches really started going down their own separate paths. For the next 1,000 years, they each developed their own unique flavor, their own structures, and their own way of seeing the world.
And you can really see the differences here. When it comes to authority, the Orthodox rely on the Bible and sacred tradition decided on by councils. The Catholics have those too, but they add a third, supreme layer, the Pope. Structurally, Orthodoxy is like a loose federation of national churches, while Catholicism is highly centralized, with everyone reporting to Rome. Even their spiritualities develop differently. The East focused on this mystical idea of becoming united with God, while the West developed a very logical, scholastic approach to theology alongside its own mystics.
But
you know, that's not where the story ends. After nearly a full millennium of being apart, and often being pretty hostile to each other, the 20th century saw the start of a whole new chapter.
Yeah, for centuries, the relationship was icy at best. But something really shifted in modern times. A new spirit of dialogue, of mutual respect, started to emerge, cracking open a door that had been sealed shut for ages.
Now, people had tried before. There were these reunion councils in the Middle Ages, but they pretty much all failed, mostly because of politics. The real game changer was the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. That's when the Catholic Church basically said, okay, let's change our tone, and started treating the Orthodox Church as a sister, not a rival. And that kicked off the modern dialogues that are still happening today, trying to untie 1,000 years of theological knots.
And here's a really important thing to remember. The split didn't kill either of them. In fact, you could argue it forced them to double down on who they were. Both traditions thrived, becoming these incredibly powerful forces that have shaped countless cultures and billions of lives across the globe.
So what's the bottom line here? Why should we care about a religious beef from 1,000 years ago? Because it's not just dusty old history. It's a living, breathing story that directly impacts the faith of over 2 billion people today, and it continues to influence everything from global politics to art and culture.
Which brings us to the big final question. Pope John Paul II famously called the East and West the two lungs of the Church. So after 1,000 years of breathing on their own, is it even possible for them to breathe together as one again? Well, that's a question that faith and time have yet to answer.